turning up. We've got 20 people joined us already, and I suspect we'll probably pop up to our number of 40 as we've done for the last couple of weeks. Mike Durant is presenting tonight on the second part of the set of competencies around thermaling, in particular thermal entry and exit, and thermaling with other gliders. And he may touch a little on flying and gaggles as well, just to broaden out the topic a bit. Mike's a pretty experienced guy. He's won the Nationals a few times in his LS8, and is for his sins been made the comps director for the World Gliding Comps. So he's run a Horsham week, and they reckon that was good enough to prepare him for a world comp. So he's got an exciting 3 or 4 months ahead of him, but great to have him just talking about this, because he can bring a lot of experience to this topic. As ever, if you have any questions for Mike, the best way to do it is to just pop it in the chat, given that we do have such a large number of people here today. And if you do need any other questions followed up or whatever, you can certainly ask your local coaches, or send Mike or myself an email, and we can follow that up with you. The other thing I should mention is Mike is the Soaring Development Manager for Victoria and Tasmania, which means he has special responsibility for developing soaring in our region. So over to you, Mike, and I hope everyone enjoys the show.
Thanks, Dave. And after that lead in, I hope I can keep everybody amused and pass on some knowledge, because so in this so this is part of the standard material that is used in the silver coaching courses, and then development of GPC pilots. So all of this material should be reasonably familiar to people that have gone through the GPC training recently. All of this material has been issued for around about 12 months. So maybe nothing new here. If you've got any questions, please ask them, and I'll go through this material and try and talk people through it. So this is the theory lesson, and then there's a whole bunch of practical lessons to go through with pilot guides and trainer guides, and all of those are available on the GFA website under the coaching training material. So what this unit covers is the theory around identifying a thermal in the cruise, the limitations of varios and how they can mislead you if you're not experienced, and the steps to follow in a methodical way to enter a thermal and then start the centering process, which you went through in last week's theory lesson. So obvious things: to find a thermal, you should try to fly where you expect a thermal to be. It's pretty easy when people say that. Under a cumulus cloud, which cumulus cloud? There's a whole bunch of views on that, but generally when you get a little bit of experience, you can tell the building clouds from the ones which are decaying. Typically cloud or thermals have around about a half an hour life, depends on the day, but not every cumulus is a good one, about 1 in 3. And you need to plan for a sequence of clouds to fly under on the view that one third of those will work. 1/3 will be maybe you can stay up, and 1/3 will be decaying and not worth the effort. Fly over good thermal sources and triggers. That depends on the country that you're flying in. In southeastern Australia, Victoria and New South Wales, tends to be the drier, darker paddocks. I always, if I get low, tend to fly towards farmhouses and if there's machinery in a paddock. Everybody has their favourite thermal source. Again, there's a degree of experience in that and what works in the particular terrain you're in. One of the things to always remember is that thermals drift. And so flying overhead a trigger on a 10-knot day with a 10-knot wind, you won't find the thermal there. The thermal will have drifted downwind. So unless you're down at dot feet over the ground, the thermal isn't there. The thermal has drifted downwind from the thermal source. So it's always useful, if you can, to line up the thermal sources into wind if you're getting low and you're really after a climb, and try and work your way into wind up along where the thermal might have drifted. So that's something to keep in mind. And obviously where other gliders are thermaling, the best thermal markers are other gliders, eagles. Eagles do not thermal in crap. They're always in the best climb around. And so always go and try and find particularly eagles, but other birds, ibises and various other kinds. Pelicans are a good thermal marker as well, if you're up around the Murray. As you approach thermal, you'll feel the air become more turbulent. It's possibly lifting one wing or both, and maybe feel some sinking air as you come into the thermal, because the air is going up in the thermal and then it's sinking down the outside. But prior to the thermal, you get people talk about cobblestones. It's just a little bit of rough air. That area and the width of that area depends on the day. If it's a high cumulus day, then that area can be quite large, and you may have to run into the thermal for a long way before you find the climb. On a blue day, which is only going to 4,000 or 5,000 feet, often there's very little warning before you hit the thermal. And that makes low blue days particularly challenging, because often there's little notice and you don't have cumulus to mark the climb. So it takes quite a bit of experience to get good at low blue days. And that's why those days are challenging, particularly down. We get quite a few of those down here in Victoria and in southern New South Wales. When you come into that, if you find the climb and you run straight into it, you'll feel a sustained upward surge. Now that's different from a gust. A gust is a sharp jolt. A sustained upward surge, remembering that a thermal is 500 plus meters wide. Like, these things are big. They have mass. If you hit a good climb, you know about it. It lifts the glider, you get a sustained surge, and then you turn. That's if it all works well. But if you haven't quite got there, what happens is you run through the cobblestones and you're going past the thermal, and unless you explore the air by turning left or right, pick a direction, doesn't really matter, you will go straight past the climb. And typically where we see people relatively inexperienced outlanding on a blue day, they've gone past multiple climbs because they haven't identified that there's a thermal in the area and they haven't explored where the climb might be. So it's very important to learn thermal entry by feel. Don't rely on the Vario. Varios are misleading, and it depends on the glider. The more modern electronic Varios with gust compensation and filters and a well set up glider, they're excellent. In a typical club glider with poor instruments, old, they may or may not be great. It really depends on the setup in the particular aircraft, and also your experience in that aircraft with that particular Vario. So a lot of the really good competition pilots will bring their own Varios. If they hire a glider, they will bring their own Vario and their own setup, and they will spend a lot of time setting the instruments up in the glider because they're used to that Vario in a glider. So it's really important if you're going to use the Vario to be quite familiar with the instrument, which is why we say when you're first learning, it's much better to learn by feel. It gives you much more consistency across different aircraft, and it gives you much clearer indication about whether you're actually in a climb or you're just in a gust. So some of the Vario limitations, lag. So we talked about that in thermal centering, and lag is the delay in basically the plumbing and the Vario to react to a pressure change or a change in energy, and that lag means that you have to allow for that when you're centering, and again talked about that last week. The turbulence around the thermals causes horizontal and vertical gusts, and they may increase or decrease the total energy, and therefore they will mislead the Vario. And particularly, again, on tight, narrow, blue days, you can get quite severe gusts quite close into the thermal, and again, that can trick you into thinking you've found the climb, when in fact you're still in the sink. Gusts can completely mask the vertical indications, making the Vario useless for thermal entry, because as you come into the thermal, you're going through that transition layer between the sink and the lift. It's got a lot of turbulent air, you get a lot of gusts, and it's very hard to time when you should turn into the climb versus you turn early in a gust, or if you're off to the side of the climb and you haven't come straight into it, you'll turn in a gust, which will be no actual lift. Horizontal gusts, you'll barely feel them because they're pushing the glider from side to side. But a vertical gust, you'll feel in your ass because it's going to lift you. If it's a real surge, you will feel it, and you need to develop that feel and be very aware of it. A lot of experienced pilots, when they're coming into the climb, yes, they're listening to the Vario and usually not looking at it, but listening to it. They're looking around because there may be other gliders around, or particularly when you're coming into a climb, that there's quite a good chance that somebody else may have found that climb, so you need to have a really good lookout. But what they're actually trying to do is feel what's happening with the air. And I know when I'm really desperate, I'm just trying to feel what's going on, and I'm not really interested in what's happening with the instruments, and just trying to feel where that climb might be and feel your way into the climb. Again, that comes with a lot of experience. There's no way to short circuit doing a lot of thermal entry and a lot of thermal entry out of cruise to gain the experience to then quickly be able to center a climb. If you feel a sharp jolt, it's probably just a gust. If you feel that sustained surge, then it's more likely to be a thermal. No guarantees in life, but it's more likely to be a thermal if you've got that sustained surge. So now your key decisions when you're coming in, it's will you turn? So that's about feeling the air, and every day has a rhythm too. So you may have cruised for 10 kilometers and you're sort of now expecting somewhere around here there's got to be my next climb, because you've had a climb every 10 or 15 kilometers for the last hour. So there's a rhythm to the day. The really good pilots figure that rhythm out pretty quickly. But if you're identifying if it is actually a thermal and not just a gust, that's about feel. You then got to, is it safe to turn? So you've always got to be aware of what's around you. Flarm helps. Is there any traffic around you? But so many flarm setups outside of sort of high level competitions, the flarms can be a bit dodgy around, clubs, environments. So you really need to look out. So I only use a flarm really to alert me that there's traffic maybe in the area as a backup, but I don't use the flarm for separation, and I certainly don't rely on it if I'm going to turn into a climb. You've got to be looking, and you've got to be looking above you, because if you pull into the climb, you're going to, and you get it right, you can gain a surprising amount of height. I once counted the individual flecks of dirt on the gear doors of a glider above me when I pulled into a climb too aggressively at a comp. Way, way too close. So be careful when you're pulling into the climb, and be careful to make sure you have a really good lookout. There's always the question, if you find the thermal, do you need to turn? You don't, if you've got plenty of height and you're trying to make tracks and speed, you don't need to take every single climb. If you're practicing thermal entry, then sure, go and take every climb you can, see how well you can enter. This is something that needs real practice. So is it a thermal? Is it safe to turn? Do I need to turn? Okay, when am I going to turn? So I've run across the cobblestones, I've run into some sink. Right, sink's good now because I think on the other side of that sink there's a climb, so I'm going to drive through, get a bit of lift. Do I turn? Or my recommendation is wait until you get the surge, then turn. Not the first Vario indication. You really need to push through, feel the surge, and then turn. Which way to turn? Frankly, that is a tertiary question. I've been doing this a lot. I might be a bit better than 50-50 in terms of getting it right, which way to turn. Much easier under queue, where you can line yourself up under the queue and you know where it is again. It's on the northeastern side of the queues today because the wind's coming from that direction. And you can turn into the core pretty regularly. On a blue day, where you're at speed and you pull into the climb, it's a gamble. People go, the wing's going up on the left, I'm going to turn right. And yeah, okay, maybe. But my experience, it's pretty much a gamble. The key thing is when to turn. So, and I've seen people go into the climb and go, oh, should I turn left? Should I turn right? Should I turn left? Should I turn? Boom, they're through it. It's much more important to prioritize when to turn than which way to turn, right? Don't get hung up on trying to turn the right way, because if you turn the wrong way, you can fix it pretty quickly. But if you go through the climb, you've just wasted that. Thermal entry. You may notice the turbulence and the cobblestone effect at the edge of the thermal. They talk about it as a cobblestone. It's rough, turbulent air. And as I say, the size of the area depends on the day, depends on the thermal conditions, depends on how the air is sharing based on whether it's windy or not. So each day is different. And the other thing, just be aware of, is it can be different on different legs of a task. And the reason for that is if it's windy and the wind is increasing with altitude and it's sharing, or then when you're heading north into a northerly, you can have quite long runs running into the lift. If you're running south on that day, there'll be almost nothing ahead of it, and then you'll hit the climb. Just because of the way, because thermals do stand up, they have mass. They have tons of mass. So they do actually stand up into the wind a bit, right? They fundamentally drift with the wind, but they have mass and they do stand up into the wind. And be aware that depending on the direction you're approaching the thermal relative to the wind, the area, size, nature of the warning you'll have will be different. And a lot of people will be going great guns down one leg, they'll turn the corner onto the next leg and it'll all fall into a heap. And they just haven't adjusted for the fact that it's got a different feel, right? So just be careful of that. You may feel the sink next to the lift. Again, the size of that area of sink ahead of the lift, it can be almost nothing and you just run smack into a thermal. It can be quite a big area. Again, it depends on the day, depends on the height of the climb, depends on whether it's blue or Q, depends on the wind. And again, developing a feel for that on the day is important. You'll feel the surge of the aircraft rising upwards as you enter the lift. Fly straight as the upward surge continues, and then when that surge starts to back off, you turn. And if you look at the diagram on the next slide, you can see why. So you come in, you've done your targeted scan because you think there's a climb ahead because it's a Q day. If it's a blue day, you've really got to keep a targeted scan going all the time, because on a blue day where it's low and tight, you have very little warning and you've got to react very quickly to stay in the core. So you want to have a continuous sense about who's around you, where everybody is there anybody in the area? Because what you want to be able to do on some days is pull into a turn very quickly. So always look out, and maintain situational awareness. When you feel the cobblestones, then you start to reduce your speed and try and feel what's happening in the air. And then you'll feel the surge start. Now it says here, wait 5 seconds. That's kind of a minimum. Some days in a big Q day, you might pull up and you're going for quite a long time before you actually get into the core. On a blue day, some days you don't want to wait 5 seconds. If you run into it and you feel the surge, you turn. So again, it's different, but roughly wait for 5 seconds. You go straight ahead. You wait until the acceleration stops, i.e. you're in a steady state. Now you're still going up in the climb, but you're not going up faster. So you don't feel the acceleration, right? As soon as that acceleration stops, you turn. And if you've turned the right way, you've got a fair chance of being in the climb, and then you can center. If you turn the wrong way, you'll turn and you'll go into sink. Just keep it coming around, turn through 270 degrees and run 90 degrees across track for 3 to 10 seconds to put you on the other side of your track, and then turn in. And 9 times out of 10, that will work, right? And if it doesn't, well, okay, there wasn't a climb there and you carry on. But 9 times out of 10, that 270 degree correction will put you into a climb if you've turned the wrong way. And that's kind of why I say don't worry too much. You've got a 50-50 chance of turning the right way. If you don't, you just turn, come around, and then back into the climb. So that scheme, if you've got that in your head about these are the things to do, and you can orientate yourself to be able to do that 270 turn, come across onto the other side of track, and then climb, then that's a core technique. To do that, you've got to know what track you are on. And part of this is you have to fly straight. Because if you don't fly straight, you don't know where you are headed. You don't know where you're centering to. If you wander all over the place in the cruise, it actually makes it quite hard to figure out what direction you are heading and what correction you're going to make. So the other corollary to this, though, is make sure you know where you're going and fly straight when you're cruising, and then it makes it easier to orientate to do this. So the key is wait for the surge. The surge is the acceleration because you've gone from sinking air into rising air. When the surge stops, you're in equilibrium. You're still going up because you're in the climb, but you're not accelerating up. And then turn, and you'll be in the climb. So, steps to thermal entry. Complete a full and targeted scan. Slow down when you feel turbulence. So, typically, if I'm cruising, let's say an LS4, you're cruising at 75. You probably want to pull it back to about 70 odd knots. If I'm in the LS8 full of water, I'm doing about 100, 90 to 100. I'll pull it back to about 75, 80 when I'm in the run into a climb. So you want to slow up when you get into that cobblestone and you think there's a climb there, because it's very easy to blast straight through a climb, particularly on a narrow blue day. Don't turn when you first feel the surge. You're waiting for that surge to stop, because that says, now I'm in rising air, I'm in equilibrium, I'll turn. Anticipate your turn. So when you first get that surge, you're looking. Anybody else around? And then you're scanning in the direction you're expecting to turn. And this is another reason, by the way, why this idea that you turn left or right, and you need to be predictable. You need to have looked where you're going to turn. And if you're just pulling up on the surge, do I left, right? Well, where are you looking? What's happening? Am I predictable? Somebody's behind me, following me. Where am I going? It's much better to have a plan and then follow a plan, particularly if you've got any other gliders around you. Turn when you feel that sustained surge, and you've got a sustained vario indication. Some days where the climbs are weak or reasonably uniform, the surge method doesn't work so well, because when you run into the climb, you don't really get the surge. Then you have to go back to relying on the vario. But that's pretty rare most Australian cross-country days. And it's really only at the end of the day when things have really smoothed out and you've got very weak climbs to get home. But even then, you can use the surge method. And once that vertical acceleration is stopped, then you turn. If you feel a surge when you've turned towards the core. So you were off to the side, you turned, and as you turned, it surged more. Well, the core's over here, right? So you've turned into the surge. So that's always a good thing. Keep the turn going. If you turn and you're getting a sinking feeling, then you're dropping off the side of the climb, and you've got to come around, do that 270 degrees, come back across, and then recenter. Retrim to thermaling speed and recenter as necessary, and you went through that. Depending on how far away from the core you are, when you'll need to move your circle significantly. So continue the turn through the 3/4 of a turn that we talked about. And if you feel a sustained surge, so you've done your 270, you come around, and then you've got a sustained surge as you go across on that 270 track, then you do the same as you would when you center. So you wait until that stops, and then you turn. A rule is 3 seconds. Thermals are big, right? Even the small, narrow ones on a blue day are actually quite big parcels of air. So it's very tempting to do a small correction. Problem with lots of small corrections is it's very easy to disorientate yourself about where the climb is. If you've got a pattern in your head, and when you recenter, you make a definitive recenter, you know what you've done. And if it didn't work, you go, okay, well, it's not here. It must be back over there. But if you've just done these little, tiny little recenterings, it's very hard sometimes to figure out what you've actually done to move your aircraft relative to where the thermal is. So that's thermal entry. There's a few things here on chat. So this is, so Max, speak about distances between thermals. Okay, so distances between thermals are roughly in proportion to the height of the day. So the higher a day goes, the further apart the thermals are. And you know, on low days, typically the thermals are much closer together, and roughly, you know, very, very, very roughly, 10,000 foot day, they're probably, depending on, you know, they can be 20, 30 Ks apart, right? So you can have quite long cruises. On a low day, you might be getting a thermal every 5 kilometers, every 10 kilometers. So it really depends on the day, and again, your experiences on that particular day are determined by: are you going crosswind? Are you going along the wind and running along a street? But on a day where basically wind isn't a big factor, they're reasonably easily distributed, then something of the order that I talked about is the sort of distance apart. So, and again, geographic features, if there's a line of a ridge line or something like that, that changes that again. But out on the flats, out north of Bendigo and out towards Horsham, those sorts of distances between climbs are relatively common. So this is Vitali B. If you're through the cobblestone, then sink, and then cobblestone again, does it make sense to assume that you just missed the core completely, but it's there somewhere, and then turn 180 and trace back a parallel course for 50 to 100 meters apart from initial course or any other technique? Okay. Right. Okay. As an experienced, let's say very experienced cross-country pilot, it'll be very rare, almost never, that I would turn back. If I've gone through and I think I missed a climb, I just keep going. There's always another one out there. Now, the exception to that rule is if I'm in desperation mode down at, you know, I need a climb, I'm going to do anything to find a climb. But again, my experience is very rarely is it worthwhile going back. What I will tend to do is just slow up and really start searching, but keep pushing ahead. It's very easy to think there's a climb behind you. It could have just been a gust. You might have missed a climb, but it's very hard to go back and find a climb if you're not in contact with the air mass itself. So if you've gone through cobblestones past and through some sink, and then you miss something, and then a bit more sink, and then cobblestones again, and you're going, there was a climb back there. By the time you turn around and then you try and find that bit of air again, that's actually surprisingly difficult if you're not actually in contact with the air mass itself. You're probably better off looking for your next climb further down track. But there's always an exception to all of these rules, right? Depends on the circumstances. Hopefully that answered that question, but that's an interesting one. I probably used to go back more now than I do these days, when I was less experienced. But my experience, it didn't really help that much. Jeremy Scoosh from GCV, turn after 5 seconds or when the surge stops, when do the former. So generally the advice, if you're doing the surge method, is wait until the surge stops. And as I said, the reason for that is when you come into the thermal, the surge is, you're going from, maybe a couple hundred feet a minute down in the cruise. Now you're in rising air and you're going up at 200 or 300 feet a minute. And so it feels like you're accelerating. And then you carry straight on. And when that stops, you're probably still in 200 or 300 foot a minute climb, but it feels like you're not accelerating upwards anymore, right? That's when you turn, and then you're probably in your 2 to 3 knot climb, right? The 5 second rule is basically, I don't time anything when I'm centering. I do it on the surge and the feel. What I do in my own head is when I'm doing a correction, sometimes I will count to myself, because the temptation I have is to center, is to correct and then turn in too quickly and not correct enough. And so I'll often count to myself 1001, 1002, turn. But that's when I'm doing a correction. When I'm entering the thermal, I'm trying to feel that run into the climb, feel the surge, is the climb here, turn, right? And it's not a timing issue for me. But some people find that it's easier for them, particularly when they're new, to stop themselves turning too early, to actually apply a count. But that's kind of a fallback in my view. You should be able to feel that surge, and when the surge stops, turn. Okay, so those were the questions in the chat. Were there any other questions before we look at flying with others? Okay, so Zero Patos. So are there fingers to a thermal down low and then join up higher for the main thermal? And if so, how does that affect the centering technique? Yes, there are. So there's some quite good photos around of the way thermals form down low. So number one, don't get down low. It's complicated and messy down there. That's rule number one. If you do get down low, then you can end up with multiple cores that have come off the ground, and then they form as sort of individual bubbles, and then they come up and they will coalesce into a well-formed thermal. And that coalescing is really in the first sort of 1,000, 1,500 feet when it separates out of the boundary layer. You can see with, if you see a dust devil, and it's a well-formed dust devil, and I've seen them running across paddocks, picking up whole paddocks and picking up water tanks out of paddocks and all sorts of stuff. That's a well-formed thermal that's had time to coalesce and really form. When you see them first separate off the ground, they're pretty messy. And so they, from a centering technique, it's messy. On some blue days, that sort of gusty, messy climb persists almost all the way through the day, through the height band. And they're so narrow that it's very hard to get a solid climb where you're centered on it. And some days you just have to accept that it's going to be 3 knots over here and it's going to be 1 knot on this side, and that's the best I can do. So every day is different, which is what makes the sport challenging and fun. And some days, as I say, you have to turn in the surge, you'll turn, and then you'll fall into sync, and then you'll recenter, and you'll fall into sync on the other side. And someday, and you just got to sort of make the best of it you can. Thankfully, those days aren't that often. At least they're not good days for us to go cross country.
Mark?
But there's no particular technique I can teach you there.
Mark, it's Tom. Can I just give
Yep.
an example of that? If you've got a bunch of farms next to each other and you've got the homestead next to each other, you quite often find that you've got thermals coming off the different homesteads, and there might be four of them, and eventually they come together. But if you low down, you basically you haven't quite centered one of them, and then you extend, and you're actually on top of the roof of the other homestead, and you get another surge. And eventually, as you get higher, it ends up being one thermal.
Yeah, and down low, so sometimes, look, if you're down low and you're about to go into a paddock, you know, I don't know, 1,500, 1,000 feet, some days you just have to persist, and you're going around in this stuff for, it feels like half an hour, but it's probably 10 minutes, and then it finally forms up, and then you can climb away in it. And so there is an element when you get down low of just persisting sometimes in that sort of rubbish until it actually forms up, and then you can climb away. So don't be afraid to do that if necessary, right? All right, so that's thermal entry. There's lots more about thermal entry, and if you hang around a bar at a gliding club, you'll hear lots of different theories and stories. But the main thing is go out there and fly, and go. You don't even have to go really cross country, but climb, go somewhere, even if it's 10 k's down the road to some place. Find your next climb, then go to the next climb. Don't just puddle around the airfield. Make a bit of a triangle out of it or whatever, and try and go somewhere, and make sure that you find a climb, center it, climb, practice. This is one thing that's, you know, it's absolutely core to going cross country, and there's no substitute for practice. So every flight you need to practice this. So I'm going to stop sharing that one, and I'll share the other one. which is soaring with other gliders. So hold on. Let me just. Sorry, I'm having lots of. Right, can you see this one?
Yep.
Okay. So this is Unit 32, which is soaring with other gliders. That's both within thermals and in cruise. I see a lot of newer pilots who they sort of almost avoid other gliders. The problem with that is other gliders are in rising air. And if you don't fly with them, then you're missing out on the opportunity to stay airborne and make some distance. It's quite safe to fly with other gliders, providing you stick to, some pretty simple, straightforward rules. So we're just going to go through those things. Flying with other gliders, I mean, let's not make no mistake, it does have some dangers, and where we have accidents typically are either mid-air collisions, often they are in competitions, or outlanding. They're the classic areas where we have problems. So flying safe with other gliders is something that needs attention. It needs practice. And it's something that if you're not comfortable doing, I would encourage you to go and get in an aircraft with an instructor and go and actually practice it. So you do get comfortable, not too comfortable, by the way. So it requires awareness, it requires that you maintain separation, and it requires predictability on both parties. So the way you are safe for others is you're predictable, and it's a bit of a contract you have with whoever you're flying with, is that they'll be predictable and you'll be predictable, and then you're both safe. And if you're flying with a pilot that you're not comfortable they're going to be predictable, then go somewhere else, right? So awareness, you need to keep a constant lookout when in the cruise and thermaling. There's lots of reasons to keep a constant lookout. It's safety, it's trying to find another glider, trying to spot that eagle that's in a climb. You know, look out, and look out. And there's no substitute for that. A FLARM is an alerting mechanism, and it's fallible, it's not reliable, it's useful, but do not rely on it ever. So keep a constant lookout when cruising and thermaling to locate the other aircraft and predict what that other aircraft might do. So part of it, if you know the day is going to 6,000 feet and there's somebody thermaling, you're at 5 and they look like they're about 1,000 feet above you, they're probably going to top out and leave. If somebody's below you and they're clearly looking for a climb, then you can expect that at some point, they're going to pull into a climb and start thermaling. So don't be above them in an area where they might pull up and hit you, right? You've really got to be aware about what the situation is for that other glider and what they're likely to do. And where conflict's going to occur is when you're on converging heading or converging height, and you need to be able to predict when that might happen. So use a full scan and a targeted scan. So, pretty much in the cruise, I'm scanning all the time. And I'm doing that because I want to see somebody coming, And B, from a competitive perspective, I'm looking for any opportunity to find somebody who might be in some lift. I'm scanning the ground, looking for climbs, but just be careful if you start to look for all those trigger points on the ground. That can be at the expense of having a scan around you for people at your height. So you've got to keep those scans going and not get fixated on one thing, right? The other trap that's caught lots of people is, oh, I can see that glider there and I'm going to him. He's really good. Shit, I missed that other glider that was in that climb. And we've had any number of accidents where people have collided in a climb because they saw one glider, but they didn't see the other one. You should be trying to, if you see somebody thermaling and you're coming in to join them, assume there's somebody else in that climb. Have a look, right? So use those full scans and use a targeted scan, but using a targeted scan relies on having awareness about what's going on. If you don't have the awareness, then where are you targeting your scan, right? So those things go together, you know. Separation. Your legal minimum separation is 200 feet, which is about 60 meters, which is a little bit further than an aero tow rope. So imagine a 60-meter radius bubble around each glider, and you should never bust the bubble. So the idea is that you assume that bubble around every glider, and you make sure that in any direction you don't bust that bubble around the glider. Now, you know, in competitions at national or world comp level, they'll get closer to that in some circumstances. You know, I'm not going to say they don't. But in those environments, everybody knows what they're doing and they're very predictable. But even there, you don't bust that bubble unless you're extremely confident you know what the other glider pilot is doing and who's in that plane. But the rule is, unless you're flying at that level and you really, really, really know what you're doing, you keep that 60-meter radius around every aircraft. So give way to anyone within half a sphere ahead. You must give way to those gliders no matter how the glider in front or on the side maneuver. So the safest place to be if you're with another glider is right behind them. Because if they pull up, they go left, they go right, you can just follow them, right? The most dangerous place to be is just off to their left or right and above them, slightly above them. Because if they run into a climb, they're going to pull and they're going to turn. And if they pull and turn, they're going to hit you. So don't be there, right? If you're in the cruise. One of the most difficult things to do is fly side by side with another glider in the cruise, because what tends to happen, unless you're really experienced with it and the other guy knows you're there, you're always looking, you know, where are they? You know, so wingtip to wingtip's actually not a great place to be either, right? So you want to be behind, off to the side slightly, but not above them. And if you're behind them and off to the side, it's like being in on a motorway, 2 lanes, with somebody that's just sitting off your rear quarter. You know they're there, but they're in a bit of a blind spot, and you know that if you change lanes, you're going to hit them. Don't be there in the air, right? If you are going to overtake, then make sure they're aware on the radio. Now, don't rely on it. they may or may not be on the same frequency. Unless you get a positive acknowledgement, you can't assume they've heard you. People are on different frequencies for all sorts of reasons. I don't rely on the radio. Very rare I'd make that sort of call. The only time I'll make a radio call is if I'm in a gaggle with another pilot and I'm behind them and I just want them to know that I can see them. Now, or if I know somebody's behind me but I can't see them, I might ask them if they've got me. That's about the only time I'm going to use the radio for separation. You know, by all means, make the radio call if you're going to overtake them. But if you're overtaking them, you need to be in a position that as you go past them, if they turn towards you, they're not going to hit you, right? It's your responsibility when you're overtaking to stay out of their way. And unless you've got positive acknowledgement that they know you're there and they're not going to turn, then you stay far enough away so that you don't cause them a problem. It's your responsibility. Double blind. This creeps up on you, particularly in a gaggle. I almost had a mid-ear at Narromine. There were two of us in a climb. The other pilot knew I was there. We did about 5 or 6 circles in that thermal. It was pre-start. We got up to the top and we were starting to pancake out at the top of the climb. And then the next thing and he knew I was there and I knew he was there and I thought we were all fine. And then the next thing I knew, he was just about on top of me. So be very careful if you're flying with other gliders that you know where the other aircraft are in your gaggle. And if you're not comfortable, leave. It's on everybody not to get into those double blind situations. And we rely on, it's this contract that we have. We go into a gaggle. If the contract is, you won't do anything stupid, I won't do anything stupid, we'll both be fine. But that assumes that everybody makes sure they don't end up in that double blind situation. You can't see aircraft under the nose or over the tail, and they can't see you. Once you get into that situation, it's chance as to whether you're going to have a mid-ear or not. So I don't want to scare everybody off. You can manage these risks, but you need to manage them and actively manage them. And it's a lot of fun once you're actually if you're in a good gaggle with 4 gliders and they're all rolling along and they all know what they're doing, it's a lot of fun and you can really make good cross-country speed. So you need to learn how to do this. Predictability. All pilots must behave in the same way when approaching, entering, and leaving thermals and when making centering directions. If you're predictable and the other pilots are predictable, then actions can be anticipated. So predictability means, you'll know in a climb, first guy sets the direction, everybody goes around in the same direction. That's the basics. But it's also about having a consistent bank angle and a consistent speed and not trying to thermal up the center of the climb just because you can. In a light loaded glider when everybody else is heavily ballasted and you're going to cause all sorts of grief. It's about going with the flow. So if the gaggle's going up at 2 knots and you reckon you can climb at 3 knots, go somewhere else. Because you're not going to climb at 3 knots up through the middle of a gaggle safely. You might get away with it if there's only 2 of you in the climb, but once you start getting 3, 4, 5 or more in a climb, very hard to do that safely. Gaggles go faster than individual pilots, but it's not because they climb quicker. It's because they cruise better. Gaggles climb more slowly than good individual pilots because you can't optimize the climb as well. Now, a gaggle of about 3 or 4, 5 who know what they're doing can. The optimal gaggle size is around about that 4 or 5 pilots that really know what they're doing. Once you get above that, they start interfering with each other too much. They will still go faster cross country, by the way, because they find climbs better. But they don't climb as well as an individual pilot. So don't try and climb up through a gaggle. That's not a good idea. So predictability when you're approaching a thermal. Conduct your full scan and a targeted scan. Locate the gliders in the thermal and identify the direction of turn so you can match it, even with large differences in height. If you're in a lightly loaded LS4 and somebody's in that climb and a heavily loaded LS8, you'll probably climb up through them. So if they are turning right and you come in going left, they're a couple of 1,000 feet above me, that might be a problem in a few turns. So just doesn't really matter. The height difference, match the turn direction. Plan ahead of your arrival. Which gliders will you going to be joining with? At what height? And are they going to be at the same level as you? Remembering that as you run into the climb, particularly if it's a big climb, you can actually pull up quite a considerable amount of height as you run into the climb. So you've got to be able to predict where the gliders are going to be relative to where you'll end up in the climb. Slow down and then synchronize with the other glider speeds, because if you're cruising at 80 knots and they're thermaling at 55, 60, you've got to be able to match their speed. And then don't pull up in the core. So I've done this in comps and I scared myself witless one day when I pulled up in the middle of the core. And I was in an open class glider and I was with the standard class gaggle, and I was shocked at how quickly I closed on the guys above me and only just slid out the side. If you pull up in the core, by the time you've bled that speed, and then particularly if you're ballasted, you'll make a surprising amount of height gain, and unless you really know what you're doing, you'll create a real problem. And the other problem is if you pull up in the middle of the core and they're going around the outside of it, you end up in this situation, well, where am I going to go now, right? How do I fit in? What you want to do is come in, bleed the speed, and then ease your way into the climb. So when you're entering the thermal, fly around the outside of the other glider's circle with at least just your bubble separation until an opening is available. So it used to be that some of the recommendation was wait until the other glider is on the other side of the climb and then slide directly into the thermal. Problem is that's really hard to judge unless you've got a lot of experience. It's much easier to come into the climb from the outside and ease your way in. And that's much more predictable, and it gives you more time to work out where you're going to slot into the climb. And remember, you're primarily interested in aircraft within a couple of 100 feet of your altitude or where you're going to end up in the climb. People that are way down, less of a worry, and people way above you can see. But it's the people within that sort of plus or minus couple of 100 feet when you're going to slot into the thermal that you're primarily focused on. And the best way to do that is to come in and then ease your way into the climb. And it doesn't cost you much in terms of lost time. It's much safer and much more predictable for all concerned. So plan that ahead of time. Make sure you do a targeted scan for the area you're going to turn into, and then ease your way into the climb. Again, practice. So it's certainly at the bigger sites like GCV, Bax Marsh, etc. There's plenty of other gliders to go fly with. Go and fly with them. Do it with an instructor. Make sure that you get training in this. You don't want to go and learn this by yourself. It's that's got its own set of risks. So that's the joining. Keep your other gliders at sight at all times. Stay opposite the other gliders if you can. Go with the flow. Match other gliders' bank angle and speed. So there's no point in where this gets tricky is where there's different wing loadings, and you've got, I don't know, a K6 flying with a ballasted LS8. The K6 is going to climb up through the ballasted LS8. The LS8 is going to be thermaling at about 60. The K6 is probably thermaling at 45, 50. So the K6 will climb up through the LS8. Now that can be done providing everybody's predictable, but generally in most fiberglass gliders, you're in that 60 odd knot thermaling speed, and you've got about a 45-degree angle of bank is typically what you're aiming for in most thermals that we encounter in Australia. So if everybody's roughly at 60 knots and 45 degrees, then everybody's in the slot. Just accept that. Accept that climb rate's likely to be lower than if you're thermaling on your own. Don't try and be a hero, because you'll cause all sorts of grief. Make your small centering corrections when it's safe to do so. The key one here is do not point your nose on the inside of another glider's tail. So what you want to do, if you're following another glider around the climb and you're behind them, you're not in a double blind because you can see them. They may not be able to see you, by the way. But you make sure that your nose is on the outside of that glider's tail. If your nose is on the inside of that glider's tail, you are closing on them, right? So make sure that, and I've seen this, I've done some coaching flights where the coachee has let this happen, and you let it go for a while, and you just gradually it closes in, and then you end up in a situation where you're so close behind the glider in front that you've got almost no option, nowhere to go. So just don't do that. If you keep your nose outside of their tail, then you're not closing on them, and you can continue to go around the turn. Don't turn inside other gliders. Don't turn your back on them. That creates a double blind. So just don't do it. And note, one pilot with a small bank angle disrupts the thermal for the others who are forced to follow. So if you don't want to thermal banked over at around the 40, 45 degrees, then that becomes a problem for everybody else in the climb, because then they to keep that rule about not following, they have to flatten out, and then everybody flattens out. And because they can't climb up through you, it kind of stalls the whole thermal. Now, what will happen generally is, if that happens, people just go away somewhere else and find another climb, or they get tempted to turn inside that glider, which is an absolute no-no. So generally, to be predictable, make it safe for everybody, consistently about at 40 to 45 degrees, around about 60 knots is kind of that's the sweet spot for most everybody. And that's kind of what you're looking for if you're climbing, thermaling with other aircraft. Leaving. I nearly got cleaned up with one of these because I made a mistake. So check for potential conflict and exit with a gentle rollout and a gradual increase in speed. A possible point of conflict is a glider behind and a little on the outside of your turn. Check under your outside wing that it's clear. So what you're looking at is you're looking down somewhere around about your armpit to see if there's anybody in behind and outside you. Because as you roll out, you're going to cause them grief. If you roll your wings to level, others will assume you are leaving. So don't turn back into the thermal. And this is where I nearly got myself killed. So roll out, think I'm leaving, and then I hit another core and I pulled. There were 4 other gliders that had seen me leave, and they were all following me. And I nearly cleaned up one of them. So if you roll your wings level and head out on track, they think you're gone and they may well follow you. So if you turn back into the climb, they're not expecting that and all hell breaks loose. So if you're flying with other gliders and you top out the climb and you decide you're going, go. Don't rethink it. Don't try and come back into the climb because they think you're gone and they may well be following you quite closely at that point. Right. So the exit from the climb is, and again, it helps if everybody is on the same task because everybody expects you to roll out and head out on track. It's a bit more complicated if you've got people that are flying in all sorts of directions. In a club day, people will head off in different directions from the climb. But again, be predictable, roll out, head away from the climb, have a good look in the direction that you're rolling out to make sure nobody's there, and don't turn back into the climb. Right, so it's fairly simple. There's some fairly clear recommendations, but they need to be practiced. You need to be careful flying with other gliders, but it's not anything to be scared about, providing you stick to the rules, are predictable, and make sure that you have a really good lookout, and follow the kind of guidelines in terms of how to maintain that separation. So there's a couple of things. So this is Max down low is where we live at South Gippsland. If you can get to 3,000 feet, it's a magnificent day. So getting from the first thermal away from the airfield to the next one out is quite an event. Looking for that second thermal has to involve whether if you miss it, you have a final glide back home. Very few paddocks are landable here for a range of reasons. Ah, right. I'm going to come down and have a look. So that's mid-October. I'm going to be there for the weekend. As long as you keep the same bank angle as the other glider, the speed of each glider doesn't matter. I'd have to think about that. Not sure that's true. I'll take that one on notice. Any other questions or comments? Okay. Hopefully that was helpful. I'm certainly happy to take any questions if anybody's got any questions. Or we can call it a night. All right. Nice to see you, everybody. Thanks
Mike.
very much. Have a good evening. Summer's coming. It's going to be a long, hot one. Hopefully, we're going to get some good flying in. So enjoy yourselves. And yeah, we'll see you around the traps, and I'll see the South Gippsland guys in a few weeks' time.
Thank you. That was great.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. Real good.
Good night.
No worries. Thanks
Thanks,
guys.
Mike.
See ya.
Bye.
Thanks, Mike.
Need to make sure we're down there when